Our next presenter will be, our next two presenters represent evangelical concerns over the Common Word Initiative and the Yale response, beginning with John Piper of Bethlehem Baptist Church.
This is good, and I am learning heaps, so thanks to you all. I agree with the second sentence in A Common Word, which goes like this: without peace and justice between these two religious communities, Muslims and Christians, there can be no meaningful peace in the world. I take that to be a reference to national, social, and personal behaviors, not to expressed feelings or expressed ideas. And I agree with the sentence in the last paragraph of the document that says, "So let our differences not cause hatred or strife between us." Those are massive longings, and I share them. In John 18:36, Jesus said, actually, he renounced the sword as a strategy for his disciples for advancing the kingdom. He said, if my kingdom were of this world, my disciples would be fighting. My kingdom is not of this world, and therefore Christians should work together with people of very radically different views religiously in order to seek ways to avoid unjust violence. They should seek together to preserve freedom of religious worship, religious assembly, religious public proclamation. Christians should renounce the use of physical force, whether through illegal violence or legal punishments aimed at restricting peaceful, non-coercive religious expression, religious worship, or persuasive religious speech. But the central summons of A Common Word is flawed. This summons aims to provide a foundation for all future interfaith dialogue. Page 15 says, let this common ground be the basis for all future interfaith dialogue between us, for our common ground is that on which hangs all the law and the prophets, a quotation from Matthew 22. So what is the central summons of A Common Word? The phrase, a common word between us, is taken from the Quran. Quoting God, it says, O people of the Scripture, Jews and Christians, come to a common word between us and you, that we shall worship none but God. So that's the context of the phrase, a common word. It's taken from the Quran. It wasn't thought up for this document out of nothing. The quotation is important because it makes clear that the central summons of A Common Word is not that we agree as monotheists on the formal principles of love to God, whoever he is, and love to neighbor, whoever he is. That may be true, but what the quotation from the Quran makes clear is that the central summons of A Common Word is that Christians and Muslims actually love the same God. In other words, when I read A Common Word, my question was, is the thesis that formally our religions are similar? You put a lot of importance in love for God and neighbor. We put a lot of importance in love for God and neighbor. Those are structurally and formally similar, and we can meet on that basis. Or does it mean we have a love for God and you have a love for God, and that common love for that common God is the foundation? It's the latter that the document means. I have two other reasons for believing that, and if I'm wrong, I'm happy to be corrected, but I don't think I'm wrong. The paragraph following one I just quoted identifies this summons in the Quran with the great commandment in the Bible. They say, quote, clearly also worshiping none but God, relates to being totally devoted to God, and hence to the first and greatest commandment. Thus, we are summoned to stand together on the common ground of one worship of God, one devotion to God, and one love for God. And a third piece of evidence from a common word. It quotes the Quran as follows: "Say, O Muslims, we believe in God and that which Moses and Jesus received. And if they believe in the like of that which ye believe, then they are rightly guided. But if they turn away, then they are in schism, and God will suffice thee against them." So it's clear that the common ground held out in a common word is not a formal similarity in the two monotheistic religions, but an actual shared love for the one God. Now, the Yale, before I turn to what's flawed about that, the main problem with the Yale response, which has not been addressed, is that it agrees with that. That's the main problem, and I don't have any of the objections they addressed. I've got 5, but they're different from all of those, and this is the main one. And the key sentence is found in the section, the task before us, and goes like this: We need. This is now Yale response to the common word. We need that Joseph Helpcraft, and Joseph and I have met before and talked about these things, and I like you a lot.
Well, I like you too.
In fact, I admire
And I love
you.
your sermon tapes, which I listen to on the treadmill every morning. Obviously not spending as much time on the treadmill as I should.
We can have another seminar on that. Here's the sentence that I find difficult. We need to work diligently together to reshape relations between our communities and our nations so that they genuinely reflect, quote, the whole thing's a quote, our common love for God and of one another. That's the most problematic sentence in the document. It's clear from the phrase, our common love for God, that those who wrote this either misspoke, which is unlikely since too many other traits in the document point in this direction, or that they agree with a common word. And the common ground for Muslim-Christian dialogue is not a formal similarity in our religions, but in fact a shared love for one true God and for our neighbor. Now, the flaw in the common ground proposal, the common ground proposed by a common word and embraced by the Yale response, is that Jesus makes clear it does not exist. My contention would be that this absence of such a common ground must be made explicit, not for the sake of destroying dialogue or undermining peace, but from a Christian side, for the sake of forthright, honest, biblically faithful, Christ-exalting, trust-preserving dialogue, and for truth-based, durable peace. Jesus said, I know that you do not have the love of God within you. I have come in my Father's name, and you do not receive me. If another comes in his own name, you will receive him. So when Jesus says, receive him, he means receive him for who he really is, as the divine, eternal Son of God who lays down his life for his sheep, takes it up again in 3 days. If a person does not receive him in this way, Jesus says that person does not love God. Jesus also said, the Father judges no one, but has given all judgment to the Son, that all may honor the Son, just as they honor the Father. Whoever does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him. And when he says honor the Son, he means honor him for who he really is, the divine, eternal Son of God who laid down his life for the sheep, who took it up again in 3 days. The person who does not honor Jesus in this way does not honor God. Jesus said, "You know neither me nor my Father. If you knew me, you would know my Father." When Jesus says, "If you knew me," he means know me for who I really am. So the person who does not know Jesus as the divine, eternal, crucified, risen Son of God does not know God. Now, historically, Muslims do not know Jesus, honor Jesus, or receive Jesus for who he really is, the divine, eternal Son of God who laid down his life on the cross for sinners and rose again from the dead, so that whoever believes in him would be saved. Therefore, Jesus says Muslims do not know God, they do not honor God, and they do not love God. As offensive as this is, Jesus said it to the most Bible-saturated, ritually disciplined, God-aware religious people of his day. Therefore, the central summons of a common word shared by the Yale response is deeply flawed, namely, it doesn't exist. I believe, therefore, there is a better way forward among Christians and Muslims. Especially I'm thinking scholars, not your average run-of-the-mill evangelistic encounter across the street from my church where there are thousands of Somali Muslims as my neighbors. I'm thinking of scholars and clergy writing documents for each other who know what each other already thinks, by and large. From the Christian side, it will be honest, biblically faithful, cross-centered, Christ-exalting, truth-preserving dialogue if we put these things on the table, not in any way to push each other apart, but to talk on the basis of the most painful differences. I believe with all my heart that as forgiven sinners who owe our lives to blood-bought grace, we Christians can look with love and goodwill and even tender-hearted compassion into the eyes of Muslims, Joseph and Johnner. Look them in the eye and say, I don't believe you know God. I don't believe you honor God. I don't believe you love God. And I hope that through our conversation, the beauty of Christ will be more clearly seen for who he really is. And if we were threatened in this room right now by Christian or Muslim, I would hope that I would die for these men. Not push them in front of me, but stand in front of them. In other words, I think it's possible to talk this way with affection, heartfelt longings, and still say what I just said about you two fellas. That I don't think people who reject Jesus, and I don't really know quite where you are on Jesus, but in principle, not to receive him for who he is not to know him, not to honor him, and not to know God, not to honor God, and not to love God. So I'm avoiding the language genre of we worship different gods. That is a problematic thing. I'm just trying to say what Jesus said here. If the love of God, our love for him, is to be, I think, spoken of as central, this is my last sentence, I think it has to come from 1 John 4:10 and 11. It goes like this. In this is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation for our sins. That is the most essential definition of Christian divine love. And the next verse is, if God so loved us, we ought to love one another. That's my basis for moving towards Muslims. The very love of God that they don't share is the love of God that moves me to the table.
Thank you, John. Our final presentation formally before we go to a break is by Albert Mohler at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary.
At this point in the discussion, final is probably a relatively sweet word. But it is good to be in this room. And I want to express appreciation to my fellow panelists, all of them, for the kind of respectful conversation that needs to take place, for a scholarly conversation where we genuinely care about what the other believes and thinks, and where we listen to each other carefully and respectfully, because we gather together understanding that these issues are not only of great importance, but of ultimate importance. It is good to be in this room because we know that we are drawn here by a sense of imperative, and the imperative is not merely to remove obstacles to world peace, but rather far more fundamental obstacles to understanding. And as Christians, we come with a sense of urgency about that, driven by the gospel, and not just by a sense of urgency for comity. I want to stand in fundamental agreement with the concerns that I articulated when the issue first emerged about a common word in the Yale response. Subsequent months have given opportunity for further conversation and further reflection, but I am driven back where I first began, and that is with a deep concern about what I believe to be a misrepresentation found in both a common word and in the Yale response of the very heart of where Christians should be most concerned to be clear. I am glad to be engaged in respectful dialogue, and that dialogue means that where we do not share a common ground and we are not ready to share a common word, we must be clear about that and clear about why it is so. A common word statement is indeed historically remarkable, and in fact it is almost surely historically singular. And when one considers what this means, as has been described as a hand reaching out from the Muslim world, it is imperative that we take it seriously, that we take it respectfully, and that we seek for understanding. I think one of the most remarkable aspects of this statement is where it very clearly declares that this is, quote, not simply a matter for polite ecumenical dialogue between selected religious leaders, end quote. In other words, this is an attempt, at least straightforwardly from the Muslim world, to broaden this kind of dialogue and to move beyond, I think, the crucial word in that sentence being merely polite. And I understand the need for that. There is a sense in which etiquette, which can be suggested as grounded in respect, can actually be a matter of disrespect when one does not discuss what is most fundamental. The statement describes Christians and Muslims as faith communities and calls for these communities to be at peace with one another. It then goes on to declare what, in terms of geopolitics, is almost certainly true. The most important factor in contributing to a meaningful peace around the world would be the kind of respectful dialogue between Christians and Muslims, and the fact that these faith communities, as described in the document, would be, as also described, at peace with one another. The document goes so far as to say, and I quote, "The very survival of the world itself is perhaps at stake." The most interesting aspect of a common word document in my mind is that it clearly claims a theological ground. And it goes beyond the mere assertion of what might be a common word to a declaration and description of what that common word would be, at least consisting of the two greatest commands, love of God and love of neighbor. The document very clearly seeks thereby to link Torah and the Bible and the Quran. In speaking of reaching out a hand of friendship, the document very clearly and historically, singularly, calls for a kind of dialogue that heretofore we may thus expect has never yet existed. And the fact that it has not existed is perhaps because, as this document seems to imply, there's been a lack of understanding of this shared ground in terms of the two greatest commands of love of God and love of neighbor. In response, the Yale statement, loving God and neighbor together, speaks of the Muslim hand of friendship and of the desire of the Christians in that response, both the authors and the signatories, to, quote, extend our Christian hand in return. I too believe that the hand must be returned. I would suggest that I believe it should be a different hand, a different kind of statement, a different kind of response. As in the Muslim statement, the Yale response also seeks to ground this extended hand in common beliefs as common ground. And I quote, "What is common between us lies not in something marginal, nor in something merely important to each. It lies rather in something absolutely central to both love of God and love of neighbor," end quote. In another section it states, quote, "that this common ground consists in love of God and love of neighbor gives hope that deep cooperation between us can be a hallmark of the relations between our two communities," end quote. So the logic here is that in response to a common word, we can affirm common ground. Now, at one point, I would simply have to say, fundamentally, there is much common ground. If we are speaking, indeed, of two different belief systems, and we're seeking to understand, just as a matter of phenomenology and intellectual survey, where there are commonalities, there are many commonalities. There are many commonalities between the Bible and the Quran. There are many commonalities between the belief systems and the moralities that are put forth by both Christianity and Islam. There are indeed many commonalities, and the ideological factor of monotheism is indeed a matter of formal similarity, but it is also a matter of deep dissimilarity. I would suggest that the common ground, as is proposed in both of these statements, actually, from a Christian perspective, deeply rooted in the New Testament and in the words of Jesus, does not exist. Does this claim thus clarify or confuse? I believe that it does confuse, and it confuses in a way that Christians, most especially, must never confuse. The issue is presented as monotheism. And in dealing with monotheism, for instance, and in seeking to ground the Yale response, one of the documents in terms of clarifying in questions and answers in the document to come out, the book to come out from Zondervan says this: "So if there exists only one true God, and if members of all three Abrahamic faiths claim to worship that one God, then perhaps the question, do Muslims and Christians and Jews, in parentheses, worship the same God, is not the right question at all. A more appropriate question might be, quote, do Muslims and Christians and Jews, in parentheses, all worship God truly? Perhaps the substance of our discussions with Muslims should focus more on how we might more truly know and worship the one true God, and not on whether we are all in practice actually doing so," end quote. Monotheism, the stated belief in only one God, is indeed a matter of formal similarity. But is it actually a shared ground? Is it actually a common ground? Is it actually something that arises to a common word? One of the things stated in the documents is that Christians and Muslims claim to practice and to worship the one true God. I do not believe that monotheism, as is defined in this statement, and that means both the common word and the Yale response, is actually common ground. Surely the issue of number is not the issue. No one can claim that all monotheists worship the same God, unless we believe that the one God appears to a lesser or greater degree in virtually every affirmation of monotheism. Another problematic construction here is the reference to the three Abrahamic faiths. Now, from some kind of historical perspective, looking at this as one who comes with no particular theological commitments, certainly you would want to affirm that the historical figure of Abraham appears in a patriarchal role in all three faiths, Judaism and Christianity and Islam. But to discuss the three Abrahamic faiths as suggesting that they share a common monotheism, I think this is very, very dangerous. All three do look to Abraham as patriarch, but the three have very different understandings of Abraham's role in salvation history and of Abraham's own convictions as is reflected in the Bible. The problematic issue of the Abrahamic faith, by the way, I can't track this discussion or trace it where I like, is if there are three, why only three? There would certainly be new monotheistic religions that have emerged out of Judaism and Christianity and Islam. that would claim the same. For instance, there are many contemporary authorities in Mormonism who define Mormonism as also an Abrahamic faith. That'll have to wait a different discussion. Getting at the issue of monotheism, I think one of the helpful, though erroneous, means of looking at this is that offered by Kenneth Cragg. He has suggested that Muslims and Christians refer to the same subject when we talk about God, but to very different predicates. The Yale statement does not deny that there are differences at the level of the predicates. As a matter of fact, to give the statement its due, it's rather clear about many of those differences, and Joseph and others have made that issue clear. Christians contend for Christian predicates, while Muslims contend for Muslim predicates. But when the question arises, as Yale suggested, the figures at Yale suggest should be the better question: do Muslims and Christians, and Jews in parentheses, all worship God truly? That implies that there is a common subject with merely different predicates, and our dialogue should be addressed to the level of determining the proper predicates. As a Christian theologian, as an evangelical, I do believe this to be fundamentally flawed. I think that the distinction between the subject and the predicates has a very interesting intellectual appeal, but it is fundamentally incapable of carrying the weight of this argument, because it implies that you may have one subject with differing predicates and the subject remain the same. In reality, the subject is defined by its predicates, and in this case, the different predicates are not merely different and distinct, they are contradictory where it matters most. The title of my paper would be Beyond Mere Monotheism, and it would be the assertion, as straightforwardly as I would know to make clear, that there is no such thing as mere monotheism. Every monotheism, every theism, but in particular every monotheism, has a referent. And for Christians, our monotheism is deeply, inescapably, irreducibly Christological. Our monotheism is defined not most centrally by a claim merely that God is one, but rather that the one true God is revealed conclusively in the incarnation of Jesus Christ, as indeed fully divine and fully human, the incarnate Son of God. This is where Christianity and Islam, in classical form, run into direct contradiction on what might be described, using that model between subject and predicates, as the predicate. But for Christians, that predicate defines the subject. When Muslims declare, on the basis of the Quran, that Allah has no son, no associate, no partner, it's very important that we recognize that this is directly what defines monotheism in the understanding of the Muslim world and in Muslim theology. But whether or not Muslims would state, and I hear John Eyre and others suggest that is not what is most central to Islam, that is something that Islamic theologians would have to define. It is, at least for Christians, the central obstacle to our understanding that we would actually share the same subject while differing on the predicates. The question then comes to us from a Christian perspective: is it possible to know the Father, the one true God, while rejecting that Jesus is his Son, fully divine and fully human? This is where Jesus appears in the Gospels most clearly to reject that assertion. The answer to that question is no. In John 8:42, Christ says, "If God were your Father, you would love me." This is no mere monotheism. Jesus was addressing himself to the most rigorously monotheistic people on the planet. In John chapter 8, verse 54, Jesus said, "My Father glorifies me, of whom you say, he is our God," speaking of the Father, "and yet you have not come to know him." Now, the logic of this is, again, the fact that from a Christian perspective, there is no mere monotheism. I think it's very important that as theologians, we speak carefully of the fact that theism always has a referent. One of the difficulties of our contemporary day is the way persons, for instance, use the word faith. Faith is not in itself a substance. It is a substance in an object. And faith always has a referent. So to say that there's a person of faith, well, there are no persons who are not persons of some faith. The issue is, what is the referent to that faith? What is the object of that faith? And in the same way, speaking of monotheism, one must speak of the actual subject there. What is exactly our declaration concerning this one God? I would suggest that it's not to cherry pick from the New Testament, but rather to understand the very clear and essential logic of the New Testament, and in particular Jesus as he speaks in John, and that long before Jesus' encounter with the Pharisees and others with whom he declares this kind of a very clear Christological monotheism. It's deeply rooted in how in the introductory chapters to the Gospel of John, we are presented with the decisive fact of revelation in the incarnation of the Christ, where we come to understand that the Father loves the Son in John 3:35 through 36, and has given all things into his hand. He who believes in the Son has eternal life, but he who does not obey the Son will not see life, but the wrath of God abides on him. There is no mere monotheism. Much closer to home in terms of the historic Christian conversation has been our conversation with the Jewish people. No one best represents that more than the Apostle Paul, who in Romans chapter 10, verse 2, speaks of monotheistic Jews that they have a zeal for God, but not in accordance with knowledge. Now, there are those who would suggest that that is a showstopper in terms of interfaith dialogue, that is to nullify any opportunity to have a respectful dialogue. I would suggest to the contrary, that understanding where we do share common beliefs is important. But of equal and necessary importance is understanding where we do not share those common beliefs. And any confusion between the two is not only a matter of intellectual sloppiness, from a Christian perspective, it is a matter of eternal consequence and our fundamental irresponsibility and unfaithfulness in terms of the gospel. The A Common Word document and the Yale response now present us with an unavoidable and not unwelcome opportunity to discuss these things. The opportunity we have to be in this room together to discuss this, and for this to take place within the context of the Evangelical Theological Society, affords us the opportunity to be ever more clear about the gospel. We must not confuse the most central and essential issue. We must not imply the existence of common ground where none exists, or at least where it cannot exist as defined and implied. For Christians, the issue is the gospel, and we can do nothing that would confuse the gospel. I would hope that as we seek the common ground in this room of a common understanding of what is at stake in A Common Word and in the Yale response, that we can move in such a way that will bring honor to God, and one that will bring great clarity to the gospel. And as a Christian theologian, I must say the judgment of God will be upon me and upon any others who would confuse what must be most clear. In the spirit of a respectful dialogue, I am glad to enter into this conversation. I think this is a good beginning and an opportunity to provide an example for how such a conversation may begin, and I do trust and pray that it will continue. Thank you.